Selamat datang di Festival Etalase Pemikiran Perempuan 2022. Ruang sirkulasi pemikiran perempuan Nusantara di ranah seni budaya dengan semangat lintas disiplin, wilayah geografis, budaya, dan generasi. Etalase adalah inisiatif Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan untuk memperluas ruang sirkulasi pengetahuan yang dihasilkan perempuan di Nusantara dengan menggunakan potensi positif teknologi komunikasi. Etalase kali ini adalah penyelenggaraan yang ketiga. Dilaksanakan bekerja sama dengan Jaringan Translokal Perempuan Pekerja Seni Peretas. Rancangan panel pada edisi ini dikembangkan bersama para peserta Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan 2022. Rantau, Refugees and Knowledge Production. Panel ini menelusuri produksi pengetahuan melalui pengalaman migrasi paksa, membahas bagaimana para pengungsi perempuan menangkap pengalaman mereka, menemukan kembali rumah dan kehidupan, mereka ulang identitas, dan melakukan kerja kesenian, dari menulis hingga pembuatan film, sebagai upaya bertahan hidup, melawan, serta membangun komunitas. Menelaah wacana pengungsi dari perspektif feminis, khususnya melalui lensa epistemologi pengungsi feminis, panel ini menempatkan penulis dan seniman perempuan pengungsi sebagai pencipta pengetahuan. Bagaimana mereka menanggapi pengetahuan dominan tentang pengungsi? Apa artinya menyimak pengetahuan yang dihasilkan oleh pengungsi melalui kerangka pikir feminis? Rantau menghadirkan panelis Duong, Warsan Widsan, Elahe Ziwardar, bersama pemandu Intan Paramadita, Fatimah Filza Izati. Panduan Etik Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan. Panduan etik ini diterapkan dalam kegiatan Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan atau SPP. Tujuan diadakannya SPP adalah menciptakan ruang belajar dan berbagi yang inklusif, aman, nyaman, dan berani bagi beragam orang yang terlibat di dalamnya, juga bagi lingkungan hidup yang menopang kegiatan SPP. Kami mengajak semua yang terlibat untuk datang dengan keterbukaan dan sikap positif, serta selalu berpartisipasi secara konstruktif selama acara berlangsung. SPP berkomitmen dan berdedikasi untuk menyediakan lingkungan yang terbuka dan bebas dari pelecehan bagi semua orang maupun bagi alam raya. Untuk menjamin itu semua, maka kami tidak akan menerima perilaku-perilaku yang mengandung pemaksaan, pelecehan, dan kekerasan dalam bentuk apapun selama acara berlangsung. Kami akan mengambil tindakan tegas menanggapi pelanggaran-pelanggaran yang terjadi. Tata tertib di ruang acara. Demi kelancaran pelaksanaan Festival Etalase Pemikiran Perempuan, kami mohon kerjasama Anda untuk membaca dan mengikuti beberapa anjuran berikut. Memberi nama akun Zoom dengan nama Anda. Menggunakan aplikasi Zoom versi terkini. Memilih satu bahasa yang ingin Anda dengar. Unmute original audio atau hiraukan pengaturan original audio sehingga tetap bisa didengarkan. Mengikuti arahan moderator tentang tata cara bertanya atau menanggapi, tidak menyebarluaskan link, ID, dan password Zoom webinar. Pengelola Etalase Pemikiran Perempuan 2022. Perencanaan: Andi Yentriani, Cecil Mariani, Intan Paramadita, Lisa Bonarahman, Naomi Srikandi, Nyainah Raseki. Pengelola publikasi: Amalia Sekarjati, Nadia Joan, Sheridan Olengka Mediana. Perancang isi: Amalia Sekarjati, Andi Yentriani, Cecil Mariani, Christine Tule, Citra Maudi, Dewi Harisma Miselia, Eka Putri Puisi, Fatimah Filzah Izati, Gema Suara Tiagita, Ilana Avanindra, Ilda Karwayu, Intan Paramadita, Kartika Solapung, Kenny Suryatmaja, Lisa Bonarahman, Luna Harisma, Luciana Limono, Margaret Ratih Fernandes, Maria Pangkratia, Marta Hebi, Naomi Srikandi, Niputu Sridiniari, Nyainah Raseki, Raisa Kamila, Raudatul Janah, Reski Ciki, Riana Rizki, Septina Rosalina Layan, Sri Wartati, Shivani Alexander, Tias Audi Farasadita. Pengelola ruang pertemuan daring, Mitai, Anis Wildani, Tiara Sasmita, Vera Yulia. Penerjemah, Pusat Pelayanan Juru Bahasa Isyarat dan Rani Elsanti. Terima kasih kepada Kiran Kresavic, Omid Tovigian, Tiarce Pelego, Pitra Hutomo dan Peretas, serta semua teman-teman yang telah membantu merancang dan mewujudkan etalase pemikiran perempuan yang tidak dapat disebutkan satu persatu. Selamat menyaksikan.
Hello everyone, selamat pagi. Welcome to our panel, Rantau, Refugees and Knowledge Production. This panel is in English with Bahasa Indonesia and Indonesian Sign Language interpretations. Please note that the Indonesian language interpretation is only available on Zoom, not on YouTube. So if you are on the Zoom webinar, you can select the Indonesian language channel to access our interpretation service. And if you have questions for our speakers, you can use the Q&A feature or the YouTube live chat using English or Bahasa Indonesia, and we will translate your questions for the speakers. My name is Intan Paramadita. I'm an Indonesian author and an academic based in Gadigal Land or Sydney, Australia. So I would like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. This is the third year of our etalase pemikiran perempuan, or etalase. Etalase is a feminist festival where we circulate knowledge produced by women and non-binary individuals in the Indonesian archipelago. We focus on arts and culture with a spirit of crossing disciplinary, cultural, geographical, and generational boundaries. Etalase is a program of Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan, or the School of Women's Thought. This is an initiative that creates an intervention in the processes of knowledge production that have marginalized, invalidated, and erased women. Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan engages in the act of epistemic disobedience against colonialist, capitalist, and heteropatriarchal systems by centering the roles of women in the archipelago, in this case, women from the global south, as important subjects in knowledge production. The main focus of the festival is the exchange of knowledge in Bahasa Indonesia using the online platform. Why we use Indonesian language? This is due to the limited access to knowledge produced by women in this language. So it is a political reason in that sense. But starting last year, we've been organizing an international panel called Rantau. And Rantau in Minang language means travel or wander. So this is a forum where we explore how feminist ideas travel to find new routes for transnational feminist solidarity. This year's panel is titled Refugees and Knowledge Production. The panel was prepared in collaboration with participants of our informal school, Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan. The participants, now alumni, studied global and Indonesian feminist thought, Gender Politics in Arts and Culture, and Feminist Cultural Activism for 20 weeks from February to July 2022. So today I am very proud to introduce one of the alumni of Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan who will be co-moderating with me. So please welcome Fatima Filza Izati, or Filza. So Filza is a researcher at the Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN, in Jakarta. Filza is also a volunteer for an alternative media as an editor, and she is also volunteering in a women workers community based in KBN Cakung, Jakarta. She believes that through her role as a researcher, she can contribute something meaningful to the class struggle and women's liberation. Filza will introduce the speakers today, and she will also read questions from the audience. So today we are very honored to have our speakers. Landong is not here yet. Hopefully she can join us soon. There are some technical problems, it seems, but we do have our two other speakers, Warsan Witsan and Elahe Zafardar, and they'd be able to share very important thoughts and experiences, knowledge about what it means to be, refugee women, and what it means to be producing knowledge as women. So Filza will introduce each of them. So Filza, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you, Kak Intan. I hope my voice is heard. Okay, so thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. First of all is Elahe Zafardar. Elahe Zafardar is an Iranian artist, architect, journalist, and documentary filmmaker who was imprisoned by the Australian government in Nauru from 2013 to 2019. She was accepted as a refugee by the US in 2019 and currently lives and works in Washington, D.C. And while detained in Nauru, she was highly active in using photos and videos to document the horrific treatment and conditions endured by the people seeking asylum and imprisoned offshore. And Elahe also continues to actively advocate for the freedom of remaining detainees and against the adoption of similar refugee detentions policies by other countries, and through some publications as an advisor for multiple refugee rights campaigns in Australia, the UK, and the EU. And second is Warsan Witsan. Warsan Witsan is an African writer and co-director of the Archipelago Writers Collective in Jakarta. Her writing aims to uncover the social and cultural problems facing refugees and to support women to stand against discrimination. And she is a community leader for the African refugee community. And last but not least, we have Duong. Duong is an associate professor in cinema and media studies at the University of Southern California and a founding member of the Critical Refugee Studies Collective, and manages the CRSC website. It's www.criticalrefugeestudies.com. And she is the author of Treacherous Subjects, Gender, Culture, and Trans-Vietnamese Feminism, and Dr. Duong's second book project, Transnational Vietnamese Cinemas and the Archives of Memory, examine Vietnamese cinema and its history. So that's our three speakers. I will give the chance back to Kak Intan to talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Filza. Okay, so just a little bit about the panel. I've mentioned earlier about our collective Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan and how it it is concerned with the issue of knowledge production, how to decolonize that process, and how to see knowledge production in a feminist way. And in this panel, we are exploring the relation between knowledge production and the experience of forced migration. We are focusing specifically on women refugees and the knowledge that they produce from a feminist perspective. We will be discussing how women refugees capture their experience of displacement, how they reinvent homes and lives, recontextualize their identities, and deploy art from writing to filmmaking as a tool for surviving, resisting, and community making. So we are asking, what stories do women tell and for whom? How do they respond to the dominant knowledge about refugees? We know that some narratives represent refugees as poor victims or boat people with no agency on the one hand, and on the other as opportunistic people or as threats. So what does it mean to listen to the knowledge produced by refugees in a feminist way? And hopefully we will be able to frame the issue with the concept of feminist refugee epistemology coined by Espiritu and Duong, and it seems that Lan is already here, so this is great news. So yeah, I guess we can just start because Warsan is based in Indonesia. I would like to start with you, Warsan. I have this general question for all of you. And the first one is basically about the dominant views, like the mainstream views, assumptions, and discourses around refugees. How do you see your work in relation to the dominant discourses? How do you respond to these? So Warsan, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I have to say thank you for this platform and making me a guest. It means a lot as a voice of refugee women living in Indonesia. So I used to as a home in Indonesia last 6 years without varieties of life, without surviving like a human. So in generally, I think it's many things to say when I see the situation of refugee Indonesia. So it's among 14,000 almost people across the island of Indonesia. Like the most half of refugees, 7,000 living in Jakarta, like Cirebon and Bogor, the rest of Medan, Makassar, Batam, Tanjung Pinang, or half of refugees living in Indonesia are from Afghanistan, like 51%. And second largest community are from Somalis, where I'm from, and they follow other like 42 or 49 countries like that. The situation is miserable currently after 2 years in pandemic. The number of beautiful solutions having a resettlement and surviving life is going to zero. So when we say according to refugee in Indonesia, what there are main challenge, it is the losing of their basic rights. The second thing, losing the voice of human, that the world and global heat of their voices. So our work and starting our program in 2019 was answering the gap that we can support the refugee voice can be heard globally. So that's the reason that we find the writers, artists, and photographers in refugee. So many people underestimate the power of refugees. So there's a writers, artists, even doctors, engineers in refugee community, but never get the chance to explore, never get the access they can show the world or the country they are in guest what they can do. So as an archipelago, we take this rule and gap to explain, the refugee can tell their own story without representing someone else. So the idea of the archipelago is starting from changing our stories, our messages after a long time from other professional journalists or writers around the world in their personal interests. So answering that, we try to figure out the power of refugees living in Indonesia. They can represent it by themselves, to advocate their own story, and to tell their pain and miserable life or uncertainty life in Indonesia. The archipelago 50%, we focus the gender equality. As a founder and working as a director, I keep empowering the refugee women can represent it by themselves instead of using another gender. And that was a long struggling and movement that we are trying to encourage more than men, the female, to talk, to write, and also to represent her own name in the world. If you visit our platforms, maybe we can share in the link, you can see half of our writers and half of the story that we are publishing is a female writers from a refugee community. It's not only just telling a story, also creating the writers have connection. There is international writers, artists, photographers, and creative people around. So the archipelago, we want to make a bridge that the refugee people can reach the rest of the world by represented by themselves by professional way. And as you are aware of, when we said I'm a writer or I'm an artist, it's a special talent that needs to show the world. And it's not advocacy, creative story. And the way they tell the story is really amazing. It's more than enough to understand. And that the global readers can follow easily and discover the Indonesian refugees' life through their writings and their artistry. I think I can, that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Warsan. I think now I will move to Elahe. I mean, because Elahe experienced a different situation because you were detained by the Australian government in Nauru. So the context is quite different. So perhaps you can tell us, Elahe, how do you respond to the dominant discourses around refugees?
Hello, everyone. Thank you. It is an honor to be with you today. Well, in the West, there is a view of refugees of being a problem that has to be dealt with, a problem that simply exists outside the control or influence of Western governments, resulting from obscure wars and conflicts that do not relate to the West. Of course, I see this as totally false and a product of deliberate misinformation by Western governments and the mass media. There is never any mention in Western reporting that these refugees are created due to the foreign policies of Western countries or the legacies of European colonialism and imperialism, the looting of resources and the constant coups and political and military interference that the Western countries continue to engage in across the global South. In all of this has led directly to ever increasingly conflicts and refugees flows around the world. And now we can add to this the issue of climate change, which we all know is the price the global South has paid and will continue to pay for the development of Western countries. when for centuries these Western countries conquered and looted the entire global South and created the vast majority of the pollution and environmental destruction. The legacy of this wanton destruction by the West continues to mire much of the global South in a cycle of perpetual death and underdevelopment. This by far is the main reason we have refugees flowing around the world today. It does not take much research to find the roots of current conflicts, and the West has much to answer for. That is why in today's discourse, I find it frankly offensive that Western countries claim to have a refugee problem while continuing policies and starting new wars that create these refugees in the first place. So imagine a refugee's response to being locked up by a rich Western country for trying to claim asylum because their home country was destroyed in a proxy war funded by the same rich Western countries. My response is that this is the continuation of Western colonialism, imperialism, and exceptionalism gone mad.
Yeah, thank you, Elahe. I wonder if you, I think it's a really good reflection, a very important reflection on how everything is connected, how I really like the way you put it, that the refugee problems, they're actually part of the Western policies that created the refugees in the first place. But perhaps you could let us know a little bit about your work and how you wear many hats. You are an artist, an architect, and basically you turn all this knowledge into art. So perhaps you could let us know about how you see your practice as something that responds to the dominant discourse about refugees.
Yes, of course. Well, because I create artworks in different form of art. It includes painting, writing, filmmaking, photography. So yeah, a part of it, including the paintings, was truly the practicing resistance as a way of practicing resistance that I always had to do, going back in home country in face of injustice that we were facing as women. And later in detention center, I started creating artworks, actually painting, to move on from the nightmares that I was suffering from. And in the meantime, I was filming and doing photography, being involved with different campaigns, trying to raising awareness. And actually, in any point that I have to say, in any point that we were kind of successful, not totally success. I'm not claiming any success in like ending that problem. It's still going on. But even if we succeed to have small success in like releasing children from the island, it was a solidarity of women. It was all women organized campaign and all feminist activists. That was really powerful.
Thank you so much, Elahe. I guess I would like to know more later, but I'm going to ask Lan first. So maybe later we will explore more about the function of art, writing, media. It seems based on your answers, you deal with your trauma through art. You also use art to raise awareness. So perhaps we can talk more about that. But I'm going to turn to Lan. So you are proposing this concept, and I'm sure you are proposing this concept to respond to the dominant discourses about refugees. So what is feminist refugee epistemology, and how is it useful to understand the reality and the practice of women who have been displaced?
Right. So I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm coming from San Francisco, California, and I'm sorry I'm late. I thought my time zones are off, but again, just happy to be here. So feminist refugee epistemology came from the idea that what we see in the media, what we read in literature about refugee, or what kind of images we see about refugees, is always can be traced back to a savior kind of narrative, the white male coming in to save the female refugee and their children. And so it's apparent to me that we need to change that narrative. And so the feminist refugee epistemology, or FRE, tries to think about what happens when the spotlight isn't on a masculinist or nationalist image of refugee. What happens when we turn to women artists, women refugee artists, and look at how they turn inward into the interior, into the domestic space. And so it's a methodology or mode to try to look at the non-spectacular, to look away from what is sensational about the latest image of the refugee in the headlines, and to listen closely to what refugees are saying about their own stories. And so that part is about listening to not what it is that they say necessarily in interviews as an ethnographic informant, but to listen to their stories. What kind of traditions and stories and modes of storytelling do refugees carry from the countries from which they come? And it could be from one country to the next, but it behooves us as writers and artists and activists and academics to listen in rather than sensationalize the stories of refugees.
Thank you so much, Lan. So I guess based on the answers of our three speakers, gender is a very important keyword. Warsan talked about how the archipelago focused on contents related to gender equality. There's also this feminist group within the archipelago. Elahe talks about feminist work as well, and the feminist refugee epistemology as a method allows us to see, to look at things that are not spectacular, domestic spaces. So I'm interested in pursuing this direction, how gender is related to our understanding about the refugee discourse and experiences. I guess my questions, so there are two parts of this question. The first part is perhaps in general, in what ways are refugee women treated and represented differently from male refugees? And then the second part is maybe we can go deeper into the experiences and knowledge of women. So how do women use the act of creation, the act of writing, documenting, making films, and also the act of care, because there's a lot of nurturing and community making in the domestic spaces. In short, what stories do women tell? Maybe we can start with Elahe and then Lan and Warsan. So Elahe, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Well, I found that throughout our detention in Nauru that the media usually only focused on the men of Manus Island and portrayed the refugees as mostly male, hiding the true nature of the hundreds of women and children and families they had detained in Nauru. This was perhaps the result of the strict ban on journalists visiting Nauru and the fact that the PNG government did not impose similar restrictions. And all those detained in PNG were men. So straight away, the issue of offshore detention was framed as a male issue. And the role of women was largely ignored or deliberately hidden by the media. That is why I and other women have had to fight so hard just to get us to be heard. I myself have been so active, and only after I have worked for several years on my documentary and already left the island, have I been acknowledged by any media organizations. I think because the media and the government know just how powerful the voices of women and feminists are today. And so they deliberately try to hide us away so they don't have to acknowledge or respond to any female voices on this issue. Certainly, the previous Australian government was a total disgrace when it came to women's issue in general. But what I saw with my own eyes was that when women both inside and outside of detention, as I told you, worked together and pushed for a campaign to have the children and families released from detention, there was really nothing the government could do against us, because feminism is meant to empower the weak and raise the voices of the voiceless. When we did this with the support of feminist organization in Australia, we succeeded in saving these families from Nauru. But having seen the power of feminism in action, the government of Australia feared the new media attention and released all other females, leaving only single males still imprisoned in Nauru today. By removing the female voice from Nauru, they once again quietened down the situation. But we as feminists and women will not allow this issue to be forgotten and delayed any longer. And we continue to fight in every way possible for a final end to Australia's asylum seeker detention policy. And this is especially important now that there is a new government in Canberra. And I'll be keep working and advocating through my artwork, through my documentary, the series of painting that I'm still working on to complete. There are a lot of stories. I always say that I create artworks from my pain, from my traumas, and Australia has provided me with a lot of content to work on for years.
Thank you so much, Elahe. I mean, you know, the removal of women from the detention center, that really reminds me of what Lan said about, you know, that white savior narrative, saving women and children. Yeah, and I'm very happy to hear about the feminist solidarity within the detention center that you mentioned. Perhaps we can move to Lan about this gender aspect of the refugee discourse.
Thank you, Intan, and thank you, Elahe, for your observations and your arguments. And so just to continue in that line, it's from, because I come from an academic point of view, the analysis of what we do is focused on media images. And it's been studied that it's mostly women and children who are imagined as refugees. And there's a particular idea underlying that, and that is because, again, going back to the idea that we need to save them. We are the Christian saviors for those who are needy, those who are broken. This is a very colonial kind of ideology that needs to be buttressed and supported by images of mostly women and children. And that's not to say that there aren't any male refugees that are seen in Western global media, but it makes sense for the West to see the global South as suffering bodies, suffering gendered bodies, children who need new families. And that's where humanitarian organizations come in, swoop in, and save the children who are parentless, who are familyless. And then as for the images themselves, they must be mute because refugees cannot speak. And it is through art, like what you do, Alahi, and what Warsan does, what you both do, is to say that refugees have voices. And as part of the collective for the critical refugee studies, we try to argue not that we have one voice, but we have many voices. And it's so important that we say that there's just not one voice for the voiceless, but there's a multitude of voices, and we must listen in order to listen to and hear and imagine our humanity in refugees. So it's about art, it's about creation, it's about imagination, community, humanity. And what we try to do is turn away from those media images that seek to dehumanize us at every turn.
Thank you so much, Lan. I guess my this question also applies to Warsan. So perhaps Warsan, you can talk more about the specific experiences of refugee women, and also the kinds of stories that women tell through their art, through writing or films or other forms of art and care. Yes, go ahead, Warsan.
Thank you. Really, I think like already what I would like to say, Ella has said, because we are the same background experience. But what I would like to add is like to explain clearly the struggling for refugee women and feminists. It's not only for privileged side or a Western and government policy. Even the refugee woman is struggling in her own family, own traditional thinkings. So the word of refugee woman is treated differently, or yes or no? Absolutely yes. Inside and outside. Start from the home, they navigate the same rights and equality opportunity than the boy. So you can see 89% of refugee women in Indonesia, they are illiteracy, didn't get chance to go to schools. While the man, they can read, they can have a many language. And that was one of the story that I started my movement today. Like why the women didn't get like a human what they need. So my first article that I wrote was refugee women education rights. And then many people said, oh, you want a woman become educators? I said, it's the key of life. We don't need to get this financial assistance or go on resettlement. Since we cannot read, we cannot write anything in this world. And really, the thing is that based on equality, it is them and the life of females of refugee. They believe they cannot able to grow, they cannot have a same life like a man. And even the country that we live in, Indonesia, never give attention. So there's a many feminist organizations like this platform we are today, or other things like many marginalized groups. We try to reach them, to tell them we are here, women, and woman is a woman wherever they are. And I really appreciated the policy of Indonesia. They respect child and women, but it still needs a document, not be applying to get the rights as a refugee women and children to meet that. What has become the artistic? I was remember in early 2020, we hold artist competition, the archipelago. The winner was a Farsana, she's from Afghanistan woman. The picture that we chose as a comment was a naked woman. And really, I like the caption because she's explaining to cover my body without arthritis doesn't make any sense. This is my body, it belongs to me. So I have a choices, And then many men in the community, this is worsen, are he insane? This is the artist that the woman explaining what if he want to do it. And to win that caption, it takes me like days to explain this is the voice that woman represented, the rights of her body, the rights of her life, since she is a refugee. So it's a showing, I agree with Ella, the feminist is not taking a voice of refugee women, but it's a taking a voice of humanity. We not leave behind and want to put a risky place for a man, but just teaching him this is nothing to belong to only for him. It's belong to all humanity, child, women, and men, to get the same platform to survive. So the women tell the story. The story, especially I encourage the lately, it's traditional thing. 2 months before we publish a story about the period, experience it getting the young girl get her period. And then the comment is, and this seems like, oh, wow, you guys go far. You want to tell the world the experience of period from refugee women when you never get the school education, how to deal with your body and changes and being a mature. So it is really something we need to teach the world, and even as a refugee woman, to express it's normal to talk. And this story that they are telling, like the refugee woman education background, traditional things, marriage problems, it will be increased the feminist power, and at the same time will be increased the community prosperity. I believe, as Warsen always, if one woman get the full educated, all the family will be safe and prosperity the rest of their life. Because always the women are focusing only by not themselves. They are caring. They have a natural in caring and fundamental of the family. So that's why the archipelago, I make sure everything is 50-50 when it's become gender equality. And also the refugee women get attention. Whatever they want to tell the world, they have a freedom of voice, freedom of telling the story with their own way, without permission from another gender or something like that. And this is really what we want to make sure. And even we fighting, even if we are in Indonesia, in a low country, but I'm sure one day it's become something normalized to talk about period, LGBT things, marriage problems, like the women can tell easily. Now they're ashamed, they feel many negative comments, but still is fighting. Thank you, Intan.
Thank you so much, Warsan, for like a very comprehensive answer. So I will let Filza take over from here. So Filza will ask her own question for you, and then she will take questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you, Kak Intan. So before I ask my question, a friendly reminder for the audience: you can ask questions in Indonesian language, and we will translate it for you, for the speakers. And for my question, so for our three speakers, I want to ask first of all is, how is knowledge production possible amid various limitations of the situation faced by women refugees, especially in terms of language barriers? Maybe we can start with, I don't know, Ilahi or?
Yeah, sure. Well, language barrier is a huge problem in communicating with refugees, as challenging as cultural differences. But in terms of creating artworks, it can change to a potential, as Lan just explained well. Because of language barriers, people try to express themselves through artworks, by drawing, by painting. And it's actually one of the skills in communicating when you do community services, that the way that you can communicate with refugees. And then from the other hand, in terms of creative product, it reminds us about the importance of the role of a translator in the creative writing. That the way that a translator interprets the words of someone's in the like native language, you know. That's what I think and what I know about that. And this is a big challenge that you always need to try to improve your, in most of the case, English, unless the asylum seekers are like in other countries with other languages, with the new language that you're not speaking to, the second language of the countries that you are seeking asylum. So it's an ongoing challenges in different levels, I think.
Okay, thank you. And Lan, before we go to Warsan and go to some questions from audience.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's so important to think about translation and language. But I'm hearing too in our conversation that we have to go back to the idea of knowledge production, which is what my co-writer and I spoke about. It is just also recognizing that whatever language we speak, we are producing knowledge. And it takes a lot of decolonial thought to get us out of the idea that our stories matter. And so if we get to that point where our translations, our storytelling, and our stories and our histories matter, I think that's the first step. But in terms of speaking to, yes, the global north, the Western worlds, we need to recognize that the system of who gets to speak is already rigged, right? We don't have access to a platform. So whoever the elite publishing world or art world selects to speak on behalf of the global South, that depends on how they write or how they create, what languages they speak. And so I think that we need to recognize that that's the system that we're embedded in. And it's a system of power that has been with us since colonialism. To recognize that system of power that we're in is also then try to change it. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is to recognize that there's a lot of work to do. But one of the important things I think in this whole process is to understand that our stories matter first, and that we do produce knowledge, and to get to that point where, as Warsan talked about, for refugee women to even feel confident and feel like they have access to a platform where, again, their stories and perspectives matter. We need to get to that point.
Yeah, I also agree. Whatever language we speak, we are producing knowledge. And how about you, Warsan? And there is a question for you, Warsan, before
Yeah,
from the
really.
audience. So I want to know your perspectives on this question first.
Sorry, Filza,
Okay.
could you repeat the question, perhaps?
Thank you very
Oh,
much.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Should I repeat the question or not?
Yes, please, because perhaps
Okay.
some people couldn't read it.
Okay, so how is knowledge production possible amid various limitations of the situation faced by women refugees, especially in the terms of language barrier? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for asking me that. Do you hear me, guys? Do you have my voice? Yeah. Okay. This is the main challenge that I ever discovered about the language, and I think it's the worst beginning decolonization in the world because the languages makes personal talent, personal discover in very tight. And then we discovered during the archipelago life, we know that many refugee people, they can tell their story, their own language. And then we said, why we are just focusing in English while we can access other languages. And then that's the tune we start to use translators to this voice get the right they want. And then they written and to produce their artwork in their native language. And then we change it back to English and other language we want. But I agree with what Ellen said. It is really true a challenge needed to overcome. So it is the when it's become a language, it's something that you felt is a big border you cannot cross because they seems like, oh, if you speak English, maybe your articles and your essay and your artists will be more understandable. But totally that's not what I trust. I trust since we are ready to hear the voice, we can challenge the language. So now we want to go 3 language, like first to English, English to Bahasa, Indonesia. And that's really give the space everybody feel comfortable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Warsan. And there's a quite long question from an audience for you also. So I just want to ask you a question, Warsan, from the audience. So Dian Dewi asked a question. This is a question for Warsan. As long as I have lived in Indonesia for more than 30 years, I was not aware of refugee in Indonesia. The national news never mentions about how refugees have miserable lives in Indonesia, and I become aware of these issues after I moved out from Indonesia. So the question is, are there attempts to campaign about refugees management to Indonesia's citizens to add pressure to the government? And are there any politicians in Indonesia who really care about refugees? And for the information, she is, I think, an Indonesian immigrant who lives in Wisconsin, US, and a homemaker, writer, and painter.
Thank you very much for asking me this question. And I think it's the best opportunity, like I can explore the reality. The reality is Indonesian government. I have to say this is for optimism way. The Indonesian government is not part of 1951 Convention of Refugee around the world. So the Indonesian legal way or constitution said the refugee, they don't have rights to welcome in this country. And the second problem is the human rights dedication that the Indonesian government signed it. It's still absent the refugee rights. It's not active. And then according to that, there is no any movement that the Indonesian politicians or Indonesian privilege or power people, they want to taking care of refugee in Indonesia, refugee Indonesia attention. So as I start from my speech at the beginning, I said 14,000 refugees living in Indonesia, they have no public attention at all. if it's become a rights of basic needs or health or education or everything. And that shows you the second thing that I really discovered since I was living in Indonesia is the language barrier. The reason that you heard the refugee story outside of Indonesia while you was in Indonesia because the local and media of Indonesia not promote the refugee rights or human rights to people inside. So even some of my neighbors never recognize I'm a refugee. And I was their neighbors in 5 years. That shows to you lack of advocacy inside it. And so far, since the UNHCR Indonesia haven't enough power to access to changing the government policy because of this 1951 convention, it is really zero hope to have get the politicians' attention or a Ministry of Affairs or immigration, but always we work with using a UNHCR card with the policies and security share. And I think if you want to know more about it, you can contact me later to explore the situation of refugee in Indonesia. Thank you.
Okay,
I think I answered your question. Because of time, I want to respect that.
Yeah, it's not a problem. Okay. Well, we will move to Elahi first. There is also a question for Elahi. This is also from Dian Dewi. So after I listened to Elahi, I'm curious about the male refugees' response to the female refugees' attempts to being heard. So I wonder about how the role of husband is seen as a head of the family in the home country changes when the family become refugees. So Elahi, I think you can respond it now.
Yeah, that's a great question. As it was a huge change for a lot of families, mostly the refugees were from Middle East countries like Iranian people, Afghanistan people, people from Iraq, almost similar culture that the man is the one who are like taking responsibility for like, I don't know, solving problems outside of the home, these kind of things, this kind of position. But it was changing a lot in Nauru. As I was just writing the answer, I didn't know if we have the time to explain that. I was saying that from my experience, women are much stronger and more resilient than men in these situations. Women in Nauru, women were the main voices of protest inside the camps and the main organizer of resistance to our detention. Whereas most of the men detained with us had already sunk into depression and apathy. I myself was advocating through my artwork, working with media, trying to express and explain the terrible condition and the horror of this policy in general. And even when I was about to conduct interviews with other detainees, it was always women on the first line, ready to speak out, brave enough to speak out, because their caring and nurturing instincts compelled them to try to save their children or families from the terrible conditions there and to give them hope for a better future. It was all by women.
Okay. Before we move to other question from the audience, I will let Kak Intan to take over for a while for the third questions from Kak Intan, please.
Can we actually, I do have one question, but can we take this question, Filza?
By sure.
Yeah,
sure. So so the Katrina's question first then. Okay, so there is another question from Katrina Irawati Graham Shide. Jagra and Turbulen from webinar. Okay, so how can we best amplify women refugee voices? I think this applies to all three speakers. So maybe from Lan first.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think I mentioned earlier that there are ways in which we could listen closely and watch or look for stories and images that are not sensationalized, and think about how what does get mediatized are those stories that are very masculinist. And what I mean by that is, let me see. So from our perspective, through this lens that we use called feminist refugee epistemology, it is women artists who actually think about and reflect on the domestic sphere, what it means to be mothers as well as refugees, what it means to mother while being refugees, or feeling a loss as a woman. And how do women express loss and grief as refugee women? So it is a matter of, again, turning away from what is spectacular, what is very superficial, and what is mediatized as the dominant narrative about what refugees are, who they are, what they symbolize. So I think it is a real an important gesture to turn away from that and to think through what it means for women refugees to go through these processes and think about things like quiet, things like interiority, things like waiting, what it means to wait as a refugee, as opposed to thinking about waiting as a passive form of refugee being. Waiting can also be seen as very active. Women refugees are always thinking about the future in terms of planning about what's next in that duration of waiting. So it is a matter of thinking, through being a refugee. That's the first step.
Okay, so this is really related to Kak Intan's question, yeah, the third question, I think. So I think you can continue from this, Kak.
Thank you so much, Filza, for the wonderful questions. Okay, so I guess this is, I'm just going to sort of wrap up the panel because we don't have much time. And then maybe my question is something that's open-ended, and this is for you to, you can respond in any way. But first, I guess I'm just going to summarize what we've learned today. We've learned about media images, which Lan talked about refugees, the suffering bodies of refugees. I guess we need to pay more attention to what circulates around us, or the invisibility of that discourse, as one of our participants in the audience mentioned. We also talked about how the experiences of refugees are very different in terms of gender. And thank you so much, Warsan, for raising these issues of access to education, the relationship to tradition, to culture, that creates this distinction in terms of women's experiences. And we also talk about different forms and different functions of knowledge production. Refugee women have used arts, for instance, to deal with trauma and also to tell their stories, to advocate, to raise awareness, especially to the media and the government. Also, we've talked about how to listen. I think Lan has talked about, various methods within feminist refugee epistemology, looking inward, looking at domestic spaces. And I guess my last question will be related to that to wrap up. So how do we listen? How do we learn? Because listen is a keyword as well in our Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan. But how do we truly listen? How do we learn about knowledge produced by refugees in a feminist way? And then you can also respond in your own way. You have maybe 1 minute each. Thank you. Perhaps we can start with Lan.
Thank you so much for the question. It is a close kind of learning by listening, especially when, as academics, we often talk to our subjects. And so it's a way to think about their subjectivity, the ways in which they tell stories, the ways in which they're quiet as opposed to or speaking, and thinking about the quietness as moments of resistance or something different than just being silent. And it's a mode of thinking through, I guess, how we listen to stories and be attentive to the ways in which women refugees, but also refugees in general, tell stories. And in that telling, that's creative thinking, that's imagination, that's something that's alive and important. So have that ability to say that that's something that we need to pay attention to. That's what it means to listen for me.
Thank you so much, Lan. Sorry. Perhaps you could also add a little bit of what is knowledge production produced by refugees, just to respond quickly to a question from this audience, Narasi Kehidupan, and then we'll move on to Lahe and Warsan.
Right. So thanks for the question. When we talk about knowledge production, we mean the kinds of ways that we know what is true, what is history, what is narrative, what is truth, authentic imagery. So as we all know, it's been a colonial history and an imperial one that has argued about who we are, where we come from, and how we relate to one another. So it's a way of thinking about how then the knowledge that we produce as refugees is different from that and is actually very critical of that. And we need a platform to say that our knowledges, our stories, our histories matter, to again counter that narrative about how inferior or that we've been. So it's I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes.
Okay.
Great. Perhaps we can continue with Elahe. Final words to wrap up.
Yeah. Well, in case of my own artworks and the knowledge that I try to produce, I can say it's more like a piece of journalism, documenting real stories through artwork, in the meantime, as I said, using art as a form of resistance for therapy. And also there are principles for that. I think I've been always caring about that, and I've been always saying that the main principle in the advocate and in the work that we do, in the creative art that we create, what is very important to me as a main principle is, as Lan explained and you started with, Intan, is to humanize people, to not to depict refugees just as poor people who are suffering from poverty. We are human. Being a refugee is not what defines us. We have had a history. Okay, I think we are going out of time. Yeah, that's how I would love to wrap it up. So I think that's the best thing to do, the main principle, to find a way that humanizes refugees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elahe and Warsan.
Thank you very much. According to time, I just want to say one word about listening. The listening means to me learning. Like the more you listen is the more you learn someone. So if you don't understand anything, you have to get this person. So the listening is the start, or the first point. We need to understand who is refugee, what are they doing. So I'm saying same Elahe's way. Refugee is not terrorism, not black people. They are human like you. So into our job, the archipelago, we calling all Indonesian audience. You can involve our job, and you can submit your job in your native language as Bahasa. And so also you become part of our struggle that we need to people understand who we are and get our human rights back. So I think it is a zero price to join us and to be part of us. That shows us you are stand for the refugees, especially feminist voice. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Warsan. So Warsan mentioned about the archipelago and all the links, the archipelago and how you can contribute. They're already there on YouTube, the YouTube description. So we also put the link to Elahe's website there, so you can see her artwork, and also Lan's collective, the Critical Refugee Studies. You can learn more from the links. They're already on YouTube, so thank you so much. So I would like to remind you before we close that the Etalase Festival is still on. We still have 2 more panels today. The first one is Manifesto of Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan on Family. It is a manifesto that reimagines the notion of family by envisioning a future built upon collectivity, solidarity, and care. This was part of a manual for togetherness, a project initiated by Palestinian author Adania Shibli and her collaborators. It was first performed at Forum Freies Theater Düsseldorf in May 2022. This will be live streamed on YouTube at 4 p.m. Jakarta time. It's in Indonesian language, but if you're interested, you can read the English version of the manifesto on our website, pemikiranperempuan.org. And finally, we will close our festival with konser ceramah at 7 p.m. This is lecture concert, where 5 women writers and musicians collaborate to write music that responds critically to a folk tale from Wakatobi, Wakaka Kene Palahidu. Sorry, I hope I didn't mispronounce it. But yeah, so I would like to thank all speakers here for sharing their insights, experiences, and most importantly, knowledge. Today, it's such an honor to learn from all of you. Thank you, Warsan. Thank you, Lan. Thank you, Elahe. Thanks to our tech team. Thanks, Filza, for being such a great co-host, and also to the audience for participating and supporting us today. Have a great weekend and see. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kak Intan, and all.